Pure self-recognition and absolute otherness, this ether as such, is the ground and soil of science or knowledge in general. The beginning of philosophy presupposes or requires that consciousness should dwell in this element, but this element itself achieves its own perfection and transparency only through the movement of its becoming. It is pure spirituality as the universal that has the form of simple immediacy. This simple being in its existential form is the soil of science. It is thinking which has its being in spirit alone. Because this element, this immediacy of spirit, is the very substance of spirit, it is the transfigured essence, reflection which is itself simple and which is for itself immediacy as such, being that is reflected into itself. Science on its part requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself into this ether in order to be able to live, and actually to live, with science and in science. Conversely, the individual has the right to demand that science should at least provide him with a ladder to this standpoint, should show him this standpoint within himself. His right is based on his absolute independence, which he is conscious of possessing in every phase of his knowledge. For in each one, whether recognized by science or not, and whatever the content may be, the individual is the absolute form. That is, he is the immediate certainty of himself, and if this expression be preferred, he is therefore unconditioned being. The standpoint of consciousness, which knows objects in their antithesis to itself, and itself in antithesis to them, is for science the antithesis of its own standpoint. The situation in which consciousness knows itself to be at home is, for science, one marked by the absence of spirit. Conversely, the element of science is for consciousness a remote beyond in which it no longer possesses itself. Each of these two aspects of self-conscious spirit appears to the other as the inversion of truth. When natural consciousness entrusts itself straightaway to science, it makes an attempt induced by it knows not what to walk on its head too, just this once. The compulsion to assume this unwanted posture and to go about in it is a violence it is expected to do to itself, all unprepared and seemingly without necessity. Let science be in its own self what it may, relatively to immediate self-consciousness. It presents itself in an inverted posture, or because this self-consciousness has the principle of its actual existence in the certainty of itself, science appears to it not to be actual, since self-consciousness exists on its own account outside of science. Science must therefore unite this element of self-certainty with itself, or rather show that and how this element belongs to it. So long as science lacks this actual dimension, it is only the content as the in itself, the purpose that is as yet still something inward, not yet spirit, but only spiritual substance. This in itself has to express itself outwardly and become for itself. And this means simply that it has to posit self-consciousness as one with itself. Section 26 is a lengthy passage in which there's a lot of terms being used and there's a lot going on. At first it's a little bit murky about exactly what Hegel is trying to get at, and you can easily get lost, I think, upon a first, a second, a third, even after years of reading in this particular passage. And this is another one of those important turning points, as we'll see as we move on to section 27, where what he's talking about here is going to become very explicit in what it's really about. So he talks at first about pure self-recognition as being, in absolute otherness, as being this ether, this medium for science. And you notice that I've got science here and then the individual. And there's going to be an interplay going on throughout this entire section between the individual and science. When we see individual, we should think actually about ourselves as individual subjects, as individual people, with our own histories as concretely existing. A little bit later we're going to talk about the the concrete universal and the universal individual, but for the time being, just think about individual in terms of the kind of individuals that we know. It's very important, I think, in this section. Once again, I see in comments that people are getting a little bit confused about what Hegel means by science, and they are trying to transpose contemporary, conceptions of science, which are a little bit more truncated than what Hegel means. He means something that's broader than natural science, broader than what we teach in high schools or colleges as the scientific method. There are actually more than one scientific method. He's talking about a systematic body of knowledge, and he thinks that it's at the very heart of the needs within science and the very nature of science, that not only does it need to be systematic, not only does it have to attempt to try to verify things, but it has to be reflexive. It has to be thinking about itself that is actually adequate to reality, which includes itself as part of that reality. And that's where Hegel's viewpoint on science is, in many respects, radically different from that of many practitioners of science, and then what we might call the popularizers and arguers with reference to science, and indeed modern science's apologists, because quite often, although science is extremely good at some things, science again now in the modern non-Hegelian sense, it tends to be a little bit blind to what it's about, blind to its own limits, blind to what would be required in order for it to actually address those limits. That is what Hegel is trying to get at in this section, and indeed throughout the entire phenomenology. So let's look now at what he says. He says, the beginning of philosophy presupposes or requires that consciousness should dwell in this element. And so we want to think of this as sort of the baseline, this element. We've explored this already, pure self-recognition and absolute otherness. What do we mean by that? Well, everything contains within itself a sort of non-simpleness. Everything is related to something. And when we're dealing with human beings and human realities, that relatedness takes place through what Hegel has called being in itself and being for itself, and the fact that these two kind of are, flip sides of the same coin. So my thinking of something is already relatedness to that thing that I am thinking. I'm over here, we're going to use some spatial metaphors, that thing is over here, and we're somehow connected through the act of thinking. And the act of thinking is something which works upon that object. I am the subject in that case doing that. Now, if I become aware of my own limitations in doing that, I actually shift vantage point and say, I need to be adequate to this object. The object is now supplying me with criteria, which are now judging my own act, capacity, performance. I become an object to myself. I become being in and for itself in the process. So there is nothing simple in Hegelian dialectics. Or you might say, whatever is truly, truly simple is so simple as to not be worth even talking about. Where we're really interested in is how the things that are complex connect with each other, what they unfold into. So he says, this element itself, okay, once again, this element is consciousness, achieves its own perfection and transparency only through the movement of its becoming. It's not what it's going to be from the start. It's not perfect in its inception. It's not fully realized. That takes labor. That takes what we call the patience and labor of the negative earlier. So he says, this simple being in its existential form is the soil of science. And now he switches to talking about spirit, Geist, mind. Along with this goes the notion of activity, of taking things in and working upon them, on unifying them. So, he says this element, this immediacy of spirit, is the very substance of spirit, is the transfigured essence, reflection which is itself simple, and which is for itself immediacy as such. We're getting to the individual. Being that is reflected into itself. So we're starting to move towards this, I don't want to say category, but this pole of the antithesis that's going to be taking place. So science on its part requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself in order to be able to live with science and in science. Conversely, and now he's introducing a dialectic between the individual and science. Conversely, the individual has the right to demand from science. This is a very interesting notion. The individual exists whether science exists or not. As it turns out, science actually does exist. Science is actually out there, at least in potential and, in our lives, in actuality. We come into a world that has already, got all sorts of fragments of what would be a Hegelian view on science already active, being worked out, in textbooks, in procedures. We have products of that through technology. But the individual has a sort of radical freedom vis-a-vis scientific knowledge, systematic understanding of things. If we want to be facetious about this, we can say, the individual can say, screw you, I don't need to study you. Many of us have familiarity with that, having taught undergraduates, where we have to make the case to them, what is this good for? Why do I need to know this? How is this going to actually tie into my world, my concerns, my interests? How will this scientific knowledge actually provide me with something that I myself need? So he says, science requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself, and the individual has the right to demand that science should at least provide him with the ladder to that standpoint. Science needs to show the individual how to get its way back to science. That means that science has to provide the individual with some sort of conception of what is over here, what is exceeding the intellectual standpoint or even the practical standpoint that the individual is already engaged in with the environing world, with other people. What is this going to bring to the table? What is its, to use a William Jamesian phrase, cash value? So, it should show him this standpoint. Now notice what Hegel says. Should show him this standpoint within himself. Oftentimes, when we want to teach some sort of disciplinary knowledge, don't even worry about sciences per se. Just think about disciplinary knowledge more broadly, where there's some sort of principles to begin with. There has been a development of the body of knowledge. It can be taught, it can be worked out, there can be a sort of sequence by which a person can learn to grasp more and more complex things. Whenever we have that, there's always this danger of sort of trying to impose it on a person and say, look, you just need to learn this. And you need to adapt yourself to it. Don't worry about whether it has any way of meeting you where you are. Now, we can go way too far with this and swing to the other extreme and totally instrumentalize disciplinary knowledge and say, well, unless it really appeals to you, little so-and-so, it's no good. And in fact, it's interesting to see the discussions that have taken place recently in terms of the American Common Core and mathematics and how mathematics ought to be taught. There is actually something to be said for telling kids, hey, do the problems, learn the stuff, and then we'll talk about applications. And there's been this swinging to the other extreme of, well, we got to start with applications because that's going to get them interested and it'll situate them. And, Hegel would actually say, you need both sides Too much of one is bad, too much of the other is bad. There needs to be an interplay, a dynamic interplay between them. So, science ought to supply that to the individual. And here's where Hegel begins to introduce, you notice I've got this term antithesis thrown all over the place here. The individual is the immediate certainty of himself. That means that we actually know that we exist. We, like it or not, can't get away from ourselves, not for long at least, and we're aware that we're engaged with things. We're aware that we have a history. We're aware that we face concrete problems. So we have immediate certainty of ourselves. And we are therefore, Hegel says, if you like this way of saying it, unconditioned being. For each one of ourselves, we kind of feel unnaturally, because this is the nature of consciousness, like we are at the center of things, and everything exists in relation to us. It is for us, whereas we are, to a certain degree, unconditioned in ourselves. Now, we can lose sight of that very quickly. Just go to work, and you suddenly realize you're not the center of the universe because you have to, punch a clock or put up with people's BS or who knows. Then you don't have immediate certainty of yourself at that moment. But it restores. You get off of work, get home. Our homes are where, we turn these into places that are supposed to be reflections of our importance, our centrality. And we get very upset when people mess them up, right? Or when we have to hear our neighbor and their nonsense down the road. So, he says, the standpoint of consciousness which knows objects in their antithesis to itself, and itself in antithesis to objects. Now, antithesis, opposition, as being other. The objects are something different from the self. This chalk is different from me. As a matter of fact, my clothing is something different from me. Right? Antithesis, try not to get yourself caught up in the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Everyone wants to make Hegel into a constant triangle, because that would actually be out of place here. He's interested in these antitheses, and he says, look, individuals exist in relation to their environing objects, which they are to a certain degree superior to, but they're also conditioned by, and those, they don't determine us in the sense of like make us do or make us think exactly what we are, because we do have some degree of freedom, but they do condition us, and we condition them in turn. And it's individuated. Your environing world, although we may share it, is not exactly the same thing as mine. Here's a very concrete example of this. I'm 6'3" tall, and that means that I'm taller than most people watching this video. Those who I'm not taller than, those who are taller than me, actually wind up having to, stoop as they go into doorways. The environment is somewhat different for them. I have to watch it when it comes to short doorways, because I can hit my head on them. And this sounds like a very trivial thing, but if you're 5'6", that's not an issue for you. You relate to objects, at least in that respect, differently than do I. On the other hand, I have no problem getting things down from shelves. Or if I do, that is indeed a very high shelf. Whereas, somebody who's 5'2" experiences the high shelf and the things on it in a somewhat different way. So, notice now Hegel talks about the antithesis of science to this. There's an antithesis to the antitheses that exist that way. Why? Because science should be objective, universal, not tied down to the perspective of one particular individual or even a group of individuals. That's the promise of knowledge. And so he says there's an antithesis there as well. Science understands that to be the antithesis of its own standpoint. And notice that both of these, science, by the way, is the in itself, and the individual is the for itself in this respect. Both of these see the other as lacking spirit or spirituality or Geistigkeit, mentality, intellectuality, we might say, reasonability, rationality. And both of them are partly right. So he says, each of these two aspects of self-conscious spirit appears to the other as the inversion of truth. For the individual, there are some things, at least at this point in development, where it can say, science doesn't get this. You know, I go to the doctor looks at me through the lens of medical science and says, you need to lose weight. And I say, well, yeah, I know I do, but here's why it's hard. I'm doing all this work, and it's hard to get to the gym and exercise. That's me in my own little personal world. And the doctor can say, well, sure, you've got your own personal little stuff, but look, if you don't lose the weight, you're going to get the diabetes. And you're not going to like that, because then you're going to have to take insulin, and eventually you might even die of it. Or lose your feet, or, stuff like that. And the doctor is trying to, sort of make it existential for me by scaring me with these things. But he might actually say, well, I could respond and say, well, a lot of people are fat and they don't get diabetes. And say, well, statistically, here's what we actually know. And now he's working within the realm of something which transcends the individual, but also in a certain respect doesn't appeal to the individual. And the individual, the existential pole of this, can say to science, well, you're lacking a certain aspect of truth, but science can say that to the individual. So these are not reconciled yet. The antithesis is still there. Spirit, he says, is actually split into these two sides of the individual and science, which are not reconciled. So he says, when natural consciousness entrusts itself straight away to science, it makes an attempt to walk on its head, which, doesn't really work very far. You can't get very far walking on your head. The compulsion to assume this unwanted posture is a violence that it's expected to do to itself. And this is something that students experience when they're trying to learn some new disciplinary knowledge. Think about trying to learn a language and trying to wrap your tongue around it and then trying to memorize this stuff. And I know there's other ways to learn languages as well, but just go with me on this. So you're trying to wrap your head around these foreign, ways of thinking about things, declining nouns and conjugating verbs and talking about the subjunctive, or, depending on what language it is. Adapting yourself to that feels kind of painful at first. It feels unnatural, but that's part of what's required. On the other hand, if disciplinary knowledge is to really be what it wants to be, it has to take into account the individual. It has to become more flexible than it is. This is, again, why Hegelian science would be something quite different than what we often term science. So he says, let science be in its own self what it may, relative to immediate self-consciousness, it presents itself in an inverted posture. Or because this self-consciousness has the principle of its actual existence in the certainty of itself, science appears to it not to be actual. And again, a common thing. You've got your book learning, but I've got actual experience. Because science doesn't experience. Individuals experience. Science can only be derived and develop through actually having individual people who become scientists. So this leads us to where we really want to go. We have the moment of, clash and unfamiliarity. So he says, science must therefore unite this element of self-certainty with itself, or rather show that and how this element belongs to it. Implicitly, it's already there. So long as science lacks this actual dimension, it is only the content as the in itself. It is the objective, but that's it. It may have predictive power. It may be able to classify things. But it's not consciousness yet, until it's appropriated by individual consciousness. So, he says, this in itself has to express itself outwardly and become for itself. This means simply it has to posit self-consciousness as one with itself. So now we want to think about how that's actually going to happen.